Welcome, everybody. Lee Henson Hasty here with Leading Theologically. I am the coordinator for theological education. That's not what I am. I'm the senior director of theological education funds development at the Presbyterian Foundation. That's a ministry of the Committee on Theological Education, and we are supporting Presbyterians that are preparing for pastoral ministry, primarily at Presbyterian seminaries like Princeton Theological Seminary, where my guest today, if you don't know Hanna, I hope you get to know Hanna very soon, Associate Professor of Reformed Theology. We met just a few weeks ago at the inauguration. She was on a panel in the connection with the inauguration of their new president, Jonathan Walton. Hanna is a systematic theologian. She is from Heidelberg University in Germany, where they have their MDiv, and also in theology and economics, which I'm actually really excited about. We're going to post a bio of Hanna in the chat so you can get to know Hanna. And thanks for being here. Raised at Ecumenical Lutheran, recognized as a Bart Scholar. I think you have a leadership role in the Bart Society, if I remember right, and an active member now in the Presbyterian Church USA. Thanks for being here, Hanna.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. I also really appreciate the moment at the beginning of like, wait, who am I and how many? That happens to me all the time.
Oh gosh. And where am I today? What month is it? I don't know. But it's good to be here. I've been looking so forward to this. Hanna is the author of the right off the hot presses from Westminster John Knox Press, this book, After Method, Queer Grace, Conceptual Design, and the Possibility of Theology. That's our topic today. I love the cover, by the way. I don't know. I know you're not responsible probably totally for that, but what a gift. And just the accolades. Best book on theological method in a generation, says Vincent Lloyd from Villanova. Not just a preface theology, it's a major theological event in itself, says Ted Smith, a Presbyterian who is at Candler. I could go on and on. David Ferguson, Lisa Powell, Christine Helmer. It's amazing. This is an important book. People already are starting to talk about, and we're going to talk about it today. But I have jumped ahead. I want to start first with a vocation question, so everyone can get to know Hanna a little bit better. What is it, Hanna, that is making you come alive? Because as Howard Thurman says, what the world needs are people who are coming alive.
Yeah, I love that question. And I love that sensibility. I really love working with words and working with people. And when these things connect, then a lot of things happen. I actually didn't intend to become an academic, but things that I have contemplated and that I aspire to become were an actor, so someone who works, embodying words in particular kinds of way and performing them, and a preacher. I really wanted to be a pastor, and that didn't happen. That's one of my big regret in life. But in some ways, I feel like
not too late. It's not too late.
Well,
teach preachers.
Yes,
That's maybe better.
But like working in the classroom, working with students, seeing that light come on in their eyes when something connects, when a new idea forms, when they suddenly when I'm able to offer them resources, theological resources to now make sense of their existence or the work that they're doing in a church. Like these are the moments that I live for and that make me come alive. And I feel like that's also a kind of ministry. I understand my vocation as a kind of ministry in this sense.
100%. Well, lights coming on, I will say, during this panel, which was centered around some of the work that Eric Barreto, I believe, Heath Carter, and there's one other person on the panel.
Nate Stuckey.
Yeah, Nate Stuckey.
And the dean, I believe, right?
Yes, Dean, yes. All around classes connected to the forminary. You're teaching a class. You were just telling me earlier. Why don't you tell folks what you're teaching now? Because there got to be some lights coming on. In this course.
Yeah, sure.
There's two or three, but the one at the forminary.
Yeah, this is a very special class. It's a very special place, the forminary. If you don't know it, check it out. So I teach a class that is called "What is the Human Being?" And we teach it in a barn on a farm. We read texts that asked this question, right? That discussed the Imago Dei and incarnation and what it means to be in covenant with God. And then we dig in the dirt and we connect to the more than human creation around us, and we, press harder into our place in that whole tissue of like a larger web of interconnected being, which is not just reducible to God and the human being, right? And and that's been really fun and fruitful and generative.
Gosh, you're making me think like Genesis 1, 2, right? Created from the dust, and the dust we shall return. I mean, and there you are digging in the dirt.
Yeah.
I mean, that's amazing. That is amazing. Folks really do get to know the Farminary, and I can think you can already see why I invited Hanna to come today. This new book, you speak about mentors and people who've been really important. How did the ideas start to frame around this book? What is the genesis? Let's say Genesis. What's the genesis of this book?
Well, in some ways, the genesis of this book, like my most important mentors for this book were literally my students, which I have to apologize if I said this already, because in some ways the way this book is written is not really inviting for students to engage. It's, it's more of it's quite abstract in some ways, but it really came out of my struggles of this question of how do we teach theology as, I'm pressed by students who come from a diversity of backgrounds and have different contentions, even with like what theology is and how it's framed historically, and whether it has a space for them, and whether they can think of themselves as subjects in that enterprise, or just as objects and sometimes victims, right, of these historical discourses. And so I've been trying to grapple with that in redesigning our introductory course together with colleagues. So there's a part of me that try to and then there's my own kind of disjunct biographies, right? So I grew up in Latin America in kind of contexts that were broadly liberationist in terms of the lived theology. I was trained in Germany, which is in much more old school than many places in the US, in the sense that the understanding of rigor and theology is deeply tied to the 19th century ideals of systematic theology and doctrine, or then historicizing certain things. So these were pretty disjunct to me for a long time, and then I started putting these together as if we're really committed, and if we actually believe that we're talking about God and the world, and that these things really exist, then that must be true regardless of which side we come at them from. And then maybe there's space for these different kind of approaches, or a different way to negotiate their tensions, rather than asking who's right and who's wrong and who has a place and who doesn't, right? Maybe there's a more capacious way to do this, and that's partially what I was trying to do.
Well, that feels like moving from sort of a two-dimensional, even three-dimensional, toward even a fourth dimension or something of way of thinking theologically. I've only gotten through about a third of the book, but it's sort of opening my mind that way. You just spoke about Latin America and as formative, and your students being formative, and the German kind of educational system. Are there other mentoring communities, experiences, or persons that have been particularly important in your journey and have shaped the way you live and think? And
there are many. It starts with family, right? I was born into a family that both my parents were pastors. I have and kind of grew up moving around the world in experiencing like this weird worldwide ecumenical church as a strange and big home that is then, in many of the individual places that we get into, also very narrow and difficult, but also is this amazing way of being connected to other people, just because they're also part of the body of Christ. And then sometimes somehow you just have to put up with one another. And that's actually wonderful and hard, but also wonderful. I have, so one of the figures that has really impressed me is my grand auntie, so like my grandmother's sister, who was a trained pharmacist, later became a teacher, later became a psychotherapist, and she worked relentlessly for others. She was this tiny lady. She wasn't even 5 foot tall, right? And she was a pious, very pious soul. would advocate for Kurdish refugees in court until she was 90 years old. And her motto in life was basically, whoever the good Lord puts on my doorstep, this is my responsibility to love them. Like that was just this fierce commitment to people out of a deep love for God that she embodied, and that probably like kept her alive, right? When her body even was shutting down. That really impressed me. And then there's lots of chosen family and community that I found in different places. And one that you've already mentioned, and that was really, really formative for me, was with working with grassroots organizations in Argentina, where often it was not even explicitly religious, but there was a fierce militant spirituality deeply baked into the work that they were doing, and kind of an embodiment of a capacious compassion and conviviality that then poured out into action and into solidarity.
Fierceness. That sounds like you live that out in Argentina. You got that from this great aunt. What is her name? What was her name?
Gretel, Margarete.
Okay. And you live it out today. This I feel like this is a bold, fierce book. It's grounded. You have a background in economics, as well as in Reformed theology. What can you and systematic theology? What do those, when you put that all together, and with this kind of fierceness, it feels like it's something new about Reformed theology. This is not magisterial Reformation kind of theology, right? Or is it? What is it that you're doing, do you think, or you're trying to do?
Yeah, good question. So I mean, this, right, my going into these different fields really came out of the same experience, right? So after high school, I spent some time in Argentina, out of like an idealistic, youthful idea of, an awareness that I was growing up very privileged and wanting to give something back. And I, because I already knew Spanish, I was inserted in like this wider web of grassroots organization, researching their work and writing up reports of that for an international ecumenical church body. And I obviously was like knocked back to my senses within 7 minutes, realizing I'm not giving anyone anything here, right? I am taking along and being given an education by people who have no institutional resources, very little formal education, and live in deep economic precarity, sometimes without housing, right? And are still like putting their life on the line in this work for others. And just realizing, right, they don't need me. They don't need me there. Right. But they are giving me an education so that I can turn around, and I'm using that phrase very deliberately, right? Like there's a kind of conversion that they're pushing me towards, so that I can go back and turn around and make a difference kind of in this world that I come from. There's a pietist, Christoph Blumhardt, who talks about our need to have two conversions, right? One to God. And then once we're converted to God, we also have to convert back to the world. And I felt like, and this idea that, turning to God and turning to the world, these are not two different movements. They actually, intensify one another. And this is kind of the experience I had there of like the second conversion by turning to God, because I turned to God, because I wanted kind of to live a life of service to God, being turned back around to the world. And because of that, then being thrown back onto God. And so I found myself grappling with all these big questions that I wasn't able to solve. And that, like, when I then had to decide on what will I study, what career will I pick, I did something like a double major in theology and in economics, because part of my questions were coming out of this kind of spiritual hunger, right? Another world is possible, that marked these movements, and the another world is possible is from the slogan from the World Social Forum, and the commitment to kind of work for that from kind of a church grounded place, but then also the real need to work for material transformation, and so kind of a need to engage with politics and history and economics. Right. And I felt like, I can read up on history, but I have no idea how economics functions, right? In Argentina, anything about the history, is like it's been bankrupted by international hedge funds several times. It is very idealistic to go and denounce the barbarity or the terribleness of that, and churches have taken leading roles of denouncing these injustices, but often there's like less actual knowledge of how these structures work, and I kind of felt like I had to know more of the actual mechanisms that work to be able to grapple with that. I failed. I mean, I did get the degree, but I didn't find out how this works and how to make it better. I fell off the ladder in theology. This is where I still am. I'm still interested in, in economics and the material realities.
It's a theological term. Right? Yeah. I mean, economics really it's not just a financial term.
It is. But so you also asked about, right, the how does that embody Reformed theology? Is that it's not the magisterial kind? I mean, you may gain, and if you even look at the title and it says queer grace and whatever, like you may maybe appreciate that I'm not as interested in defining who's in and who's out and how to draw the boundary and what is the essence or identity of what it means to be Reformed. But then again, I think
they say in the ordination vows for the Presbyterians, for elders and everybody, is the essential tenets of the Reformed faith.
Right. But then actually something that I appreciate about the Reformed tradition is that it's not about an essence or an identity, right? It's just Reformed, always reforming. There is an anchor, right? But this is something outside of yourself. It's not.
It's like you were talking about. There's a kind of to God and back to the world kind of thing going. I think you were starting to talk about it there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a readiness, right, to keep moving and to keep learning. What Reformed kind of as a specificity of a type of theology means to me is maybe just a kind of kinship, right? There's a historical current in Christianity. So there's a community of citation, a community that keeps referring back to a particular set of figures and ideas. And then those shared citation and referencing practices allow one to be in conversation with one another and to push one another and to learn with one another. But what I really appreciate about this particular loose kinship, right, is, so for example, is an appreciation of Scripture in both testaments, a commitment to be grounded in its witness time and again. It's a trust in an assertion of God's sovereign grace, but that from there, right, being put back into the world and into ethics and into politics rather than being withdrawn from it. And then this inherent pluriformity, right? Reformed identity is always about these local expressions and different times and places, because, right, we know that the church is not an absolute and confessions are not absolute and doctrine is not absolute. There's rather this responsibility to witness anew and out of the experience of your own community, where you are at the time that you're at, to the grace of God. And then therefore both the sense of particularity and of ecumenical openness.
Gosh, I think we need to just print that script and pass it around. Now, where you mentioned there's some figures. Barth is one that's Karl Barth has been important to you. You're engaged. What is going on in Barth studies today? And inquiring minds want to know, because we had to read a lot of Barth back in the day,
Yeah, and I come from Germany, and there even, I mean, I think even more than in the U.S. scene, after World War I, the theological scene was very much dominated by Barth's theology, and right. For good reasons, right? It was one of the few available systems of thought that were less complicit in National Socialism, and that had even a strong, had demonstrated a certain capacity to resist nationalist and militarist ideologies out of the theological commitments, right? Not despite them,
right.
But out of them.
Right.
And then the academy in which I grew up, like for a long time, it was the confessional question was Barth or Bultmann, right?
Right.
And it was all about who
I've got a feeling
who you pledge allegiance to.
You don't bite on those those kind of bifurcated questions.
Yeah, no, I don't, right? And then later it was about who got Barth right. Is it the liberals or the anti-liberals, or do we have to think of him as modern or pre-modern or postmodern? And then in the US, it was, I think, also in this last generation, all about rival interpretations of Barth. And also, again, right, I mean, and here much more materially, dogmatically, about the doctrine of Trinity and election. But again, the question, who gets him right? And I think in both contexts, I mean, what I sense, and people, especially in my generation, but also even, before, like there's a certain fatigue with that. So when I started studying Barth, my mother, who is a pastor and who had to study theology, like sighed very deeply and said, "Are they still studying Barth?" Like, and there was a sense of loathing in her voice,
Right.
and I was like, "Oh, interesting. Like, where's this coming from?"
Right.
She was.
I bet she did not read Barth in outline. I bet she wrote in the longer, right?
Maybe, yeah. But I think there was in both these contexts, in the German context and here, I think there are certain pockets of the academy where there's a fatigue with that insistence on being right and getting it right, and the kind of air of superiority and triumphalism that engenders, and where Barth appears as a really quite obnoxious figure. I mean, let's face it, he was personally also quite obnoxious in these ways, in many times, right? But what I find really interesting is that people still keep returning to him, and I too am returning to him all the time. And I wonder whether it's because he has such a remarkable capacity to work systematically out of very unsystematic commitments, or whether he has this attunement to the times and capacity to speak into them authoritatively and unapologetically out of these core Christian commitments, right? Precisely because he's doing theological theology and not political theology, that there's something really attractive about that. And he has this readiness, right, to start over, beginning again from the beginning, to reinvent not only himself, but also the inherited doctrines and the language, use them in radically new ways, but also in ways that are able to connect to these inheritances. So I find that very impressive and versatile and very generative. And so what I'm seeing in this generation that is kind of up and coming, I see a lot of people who use Barth in a very different way, not as an authoritative figure, not with the question, what is the right interpretation, or did Barth get it right? But less partisan, less confrontational, more constructive, as like with Barth, leveraging him for resources to address pressing concerns. And that sometimes they're making connection with disability theology or with liberation theology, right? So it's not about like allegiance to his system or repairing him in the ways that he was not able to address some of the concerns that we may have, but just like maybe even a much more relaxed thinking with him, thinking like looking where does he have insight and theological resources that can help us, struggle with the things that we struggle with here and now.
Well, listen, I hope everybody hears what I'm hearing here and can see is you mentioned about sort of at the core of the reform of theology, this one of the things is there is grace. And I think you seem to read with grace, live with grace. This is a big concept in your book too, but it's a little different. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about queer grace and where that comes from and what why that matters?
Do I have time to introduce my second interlocutor?
Well, I mean, we're gonna and conceptual design. We could be here for 2 hours longer. Do what you can do.
Yeah.
Because you're bringing in not necessarily traditional theological resources here, I feel like.
So I mean, right, in my book, I have Barth on the one side as kind of a proponent of systematic theology or of reformed theology in the sense of a confessional and doctrinally grounded theology. And then on the other side, I have Marcela Althaus-Reid, who's a queer decolonial theologian from Argentina, writing downstream from feminist and liberation theological commitments, but also critiquing them because she says they have been too decent, they have remained too committed to making themselves legible and palpable to dominant theology. They have started to do something like material theology, but the materiality that they then lift up, the poor and so forth, the marginalized or women, have been sanitized. Like their material reality has been sanitized into neat and clean and palpable forms. And against these trends, right, she kind of asserts, well, we need to become more indecent. We need to, and she plays obviously like with sexual, and she uses, right, materially uses sexual stories. And so it's indecent also in the very literal sense, but also has to do with like an epistemic rupture, right? Kind of getting through the glass ceiling of what counts as theology, being able to get to their actual lives, to the reality of God and to the reality of people. She talks about a theology that doesn't leave people alone when they're naked, basically, right? That doesn't compartmentalize parts of our lives that are that don't enter into this into what counts as neat and decent and so forth. So the idea of queer grace, and I use the term that the term was coined by Micah Cronin. It talks about, on the one hand, this difficulty of being queer or being trans, and the difficulty of theology as very similar kinds of difficulty, right? Okay. There's an experience of an impossibility there, an impossibility of living in this world, but also then the strange fact that we don't quite know how to make sense of, right? That as Christians or as queer people, and sometimes both, we encounter grace. It is actually already there. We cannot deconstruct it. We don't have to produce it. We make these experiences that God is already there, that we do find joy and life and affirmation and relationships, sometimes in unexpected places, sometimes right in with and under the pain and rejection and adversity of the world. And in places that don't fit quite neatly into the values and orders and rules, and sometimes not in the established moralities and ethics, but also not in the religious logics of goodness, but that still pour out life. And that can be really disorienting and reorienting and very disruptive and irritating, but it can also, we feel that it makes us come alive, and no one can really explain that. But it's there. And that's what we call, theologically, that's what we call grace. And we understand that it comes from God. And I think in this sense, also what has been talked traditionally about as grace, it has always been really queer in this disorienting and disruptive and renewing, life-giving sense. And queer people have a profound knowledge, experiential knowledge of this kind of grace, I think. Not to say that others don't. Many people do, right? But this is kind of where I combine these experiences to make these different grammars legible to one another, with understanding all the irony that attends that. I'm obviously in other ways not about legibility, but here we are.
I love that. And so the book is not really necessarily it's not necessarily about a new kind of theological systematic. It's about a new method and it sounds like, so you're inviting people into, it's almost, I feel like inviting into a whole new room, a whole sort of new classroom, where it's not the same. We don't have, I remember going, in an introductory kind of theological class where we kind of went through doctrines. We're not talking about going through doctrines this way, right? Help me out here.
Yeah, good. Very good. So I fully appreciate the irony that, in some ways I'm writing against method, right? This was the working title of the book was Against Method. And then I'm writing a whole new book about method. And out of a fatigue with the divisions in the field over method, and out of a frustration with theologians not talking about God, but like being busy all the time about like, how can we talk about God? But right, so my hunch and my wager is that if we examine the shape of these problems and the shape of this crisis, then we actually do get material theological insights, because method is not about method, right? The difficulty with method does not come from method. It comes from, like this weird incommensurability of God with us and our experiences and so forth. So I'm not trying to come up with a new method. But I'm trying to come to a different appreciation both to a critique and then a new appreciation of the work that method and can and cannot do for us, right? So, and this comes out, right? I mean, so we've talked about Barrett and Althaus Reed, and I use them as proponents of like systematic and constructive theology, or we could say reformed and queer theology. There's lots of ways that different subdivisions in the field can get cast. I'm not interested in how they should be carved up. But sometimes there's a tendency to say, for example, right, here are justice-seeking theologies, and here are truth-seeking theologies, and they start butting heads and even denouncing one another as bad types of theology.
It becomes a fight, right?
Yes, it becomes a fight. And so one thing that I'm doing is I'm using this kind of shared metaphor that both these terms, systematic and constructive, inhabit, the conceptual, the design, the architectural metaphor, right? Systematicity. It's about being cohesive and coherent and logically consistent with the materials that are given by tradition. Otherwise, the whole cognitive structure collapses, right? And the constructive, obviously, has something. It has to edify. It has to construct, literally, right? It's another building metaphor. Theology has a purpose and a use, and it does something in the lives of people, and it has to somehow embody these effects or even bring them about of grace and justice. And so rather than say, like, is it one or the other, if we think about design, a good design really has to take into account a whole multiplicity of criteria. It's not just one or the other. So in some sense, we have to do more. It's not, we have to do more rigorous theology and take seriously all these different concerns. I talk about in the book, I call it epistemic promiscuity, right? It not as a lack of commitment, but an insistence that like one singular commitment is not enough, is not good enough. That doesn't always work out neatly. It will be messy, right? And it requires lots of conversation and discernment and iterations, trial and error, going back and forth, asking different people about their experience, and so forth. But so this is, right, kind of theoretically the language I use of design and conceptual design, to think about, like, what if we thought about our theologies more like as buildings that we inhabit, and who do these buildings allow access to? What kind of movement and life do they make possible? What do they prompt? How do they allow us, right, to live in the world? And then if we think about it that way, then we can learn a lot from disability and queer studies about, those who are not quite at home,
right,
in the body, a place, or the world. So what do they have to teach us about the ways our theologies are built? Or a different, yeah.
Let me interrupt you, Dick, and I know we're going to go a little bit longer, y'all. This is, everybody's mind is blown at this point. I do want to ask, and I suspect many of our listeners would be interested. Why do you think this matters for people of faith and church leaders? I think you're starting for me to think about. We do a lot with buildings. We build programs, we build buildings, we build all kinds of things, and mission projects, but what you're talking about here it helps us, the church, maybe think, and leaders think differently about what they're doing. So why do you think this matters kind of on that practical level? I realize this is not your field, but I know that you, because you care about theology that matters on the ground. So I know
that. There's a person, Kevin Garcia, who has a book, and it's titled "Bad Theology Kills." Right?
I highlighted that in the book.
It is very difficult to try and think what good theology might look like, but I feel like that's a very good rule of thumb. Like, if it kills, then it's probably bad theology.
Yeah.
Why? Yeah. Because it's not about getting it right. Right? It's the message, the truth that we come from and that we try to communicate is not a propositional set of principles. It's not, descriptions of the way things are. It is something that we affirm as and confess as fundamentally good news, as life-giving, and like even bringing creation into being. It's that powerful. It's that good, as redeeming us and reconciling us with one another, and pouring out life, overflowing with grace. If that is the case, like, the way that we express these truths should also be life-giving, should also, have these effects that prompted us in the first place to talk about this. So, right, I mean, there's a place in Hebrew that says, in the letter or epistle to the Hebrews, that says the word of God is a two-sided sword, right? There are passages in the Bible that talk about swords being turned to plowshares, and sometimes the other way around. So, right, what if theology is a human practice. We, do things with words. They do things in the world. And what if we took into account that work that our theological concepts and ideas did as part of their truth value, right? So, the one metaphor that I used was theology as spaces that we inhabit. We can also think of concepts as designed objects that we use, right? This is a blade. The doctrine of election can be used like a sword to cut people down. Can it also be used as a surgical document? Maybe, instrument. Can it be used to plow the ground? What is the use that this theology is put, and what can we? And now I'm talking for the guild theologians, those who are busy redesigning these concepts, those who don't come up with them in the first place, right? People in the church do, but as we try to refine the way that they work and how they can be used, if we dedicate more thought to that, right, the affordances they have, the patterns of use and value that they produce once they hit the ground and once they encounter people in their lives, what would happen then? That's kind of the thing I'm interested in. Yeah.
We've had some, I want to thank Seth and Ashley and Phil and others who've joined us today. Had a great question from Seth. We don't have time probably to answer it, but I want to point it out to you. Somebody else working in a related field on queer and trans process theology and the inherent relatedness of those. So I'm going to encourage y'all to get to know each other and follow up, because I bet you have some.
Can you send my email address around? Or
I definitely on the bio. If you go to the bio, it has your email.
Please reach out. I welcome all your questions. As you can see, I come alive in talking about my ideas, and I want to hear yours. And yes,
I'd love for you to bless and send us in a moment. And gosh, wish we just had more time. And folks, in 2 weeks, we'll have my colleague, the Reverend Dr. David Lowling. He works with me at the Presbyterian Foundation, Director of Church Financial Literacy. And I believe he would sing some similar things that you would say today, and including God provides enough is what he would like to talk about, and from the financial side. And then Shannon Kirshner, who's actually a board member at Princeton, pastor at Central Presbyterian in Atlanta, will be with us to talk about ministry transitions. She's recently had one herself, so I think that will be a lot of fun to close out our year. But I just want to say, Hanna, clearly God knew what God was doing when God created you. What a gift. And the experiences, the way you have woken up and come alive in so many ways, in your family, in your academic work, and your work on the ground alongside others. You're someone who I feel like is always alongside others, not doing this alone. And I'm just so grateful for you and for today, but what you've done and what you continue to do and what God knows you will do. And may God continue to bless and keep you and show you the way. What a gift for the academy, but also for the church and for the world. It's transformative, literally transformative. So thanks for today. I hope you will bless and send us. And if there's anything else you want to say, you can say whatever you would like.
Well, thank you so much also for these words of affirmation and blessing. So I don't know if I have anything left to do, but just to say to everyone else after receiving this from you, thank you so much. May you become what you have received, God's abundant blessing. Amen.
Amen and amen. Friends, we look forward to seeing you again soon. Stay safe.